Cool. So I don't actually want to talk about metrics. We'll get to metrics, and hopefully everybody will learn something about metrics. But I want to talk about automation to begin with. Let's start with Uber for a second. How did Uber get here, and why is it so successful? I think that it's entirely possible for us to have predicted the rise of Uber. And my contention here, which might be somewhat contentious, is that that which makes Uber possible is the same thing that makes it really successful. What makes Uber possible is that they have location data about their users. So maybe 5 or 6 years before Uber came out, people started loading mobile maps onto their phones, but they weren't sharing that location data. As soon as the data set of users' locations became available, the opportunity for Uber to be possible happened. And as soon as that data set came online is when Uber started to redefine metrics in the transportation industry. So my contention here is it's not that Uber's customer service, or you being able to request a car, or them hiring drivers is important. It's rather that they redefine what it means to be a profitable transportation provider. So think about taxis in 2004. Vehicle routing was a pretty solved problem at that point. You knew a whole bunch of metrics like average cost per hour of driver, or fuel consumption, or number of trips per day. But the problem there was that those metrics still had an underlying uncertainty in the data set, or didn't have a data set about where the orders happened and where the destination of those orders was. So to be good at the business, one only had to create those cost per trip metrics and be pretty okay. But when Uber came along, those metrics started to become pretty useless because there wasn't enough data to make them work, and there was an entirely new data set about where users were and where they were going. So a good metric, once you have the user's location, becomes something like profitability per hour, or profitability per mile, or profitability per city, because now all of a sudden you know how cities differ between each other, which taxi drivers don't. So their defining a different metric is what made their entire business model possible. But more importantly, it's what makes them profitable. It's what makes those old metrics that taxi drivers currently use completely obsolete. So let's think about a different Uber metric, and we'll also relate that to security later on. What makes a good driver? In the taxi world, in the pre-Uber world, you would think that a good driver is somebody who makes a lot of money. But that's not true, right? Customers are looking for safe, efficient, quick transportation that's efficient in all sorts of ways, both route and, do they give me water? Are they nice to me? Uber now lets you rate your drivers, and they combine the driver's profitability with the driver's rating model. This is the same thing. There was no feedback loop to the taxis. When there becomes a feedback loop to gauge your original metric, that's an entirely different data set that redefines what the metric is. So a metric like how many dollars per hour does this driver earn is great for a taxi company because they don't know anything about the consumer, or they don't collect data about them. As soon as you start, both the profitability for the metric for the driver changes, and the metric for how good a driver is also changes because you're taking into account new data. So that's what I'm here to talk about. It's not about data, it's not about Uber, it's not even about metrics. It's actually about automation of business processes, because that's what Uber does. It automates the thing that taxi drivers do most, which is resolve the uncertainty in the market. They resolve the uncertainty of where customers are and where customers are going. Uber automates that process. That's their value add. My contention is that value add is only possible if you have defined concrete metrics that allow you to automate that process. And those metrics are only possible if you have defined concrete data that allows you to design that metric to begin with. So let's relate all that to security. Attackers are better at automation than we are. They have better defined metrics, and they have better data about us than we have about them. So the reason why there's a gap, people always talk about the gap between exploits coming out and us patching things, or the gap between successful attacks happening and the vulnerability cycle half-life. The reason why that's true is because attackers are just better at automating things than us. In a game theoretic sense, they don't have to shift their strategy as often as we have to shift our strategy because they have more data about us. Moreover, their costs are lower, so for them to switch something, for them to automate something, is much easier since they can attack the entirety of the field. They can create a targeted attack. They can create an automated attack, not a targeted attack, and can scan the entire internet for it, figure out if it works, and then reassess their situation. We can't do that. We can't scan the entire universe of attackers to figure out what the average strategy is. But we can try to approximate it. So I can make a lot of claims about attackers, but my warrant for this is that there are more non-targeted attacks being successful, this is a 2014 data set, than there are targeted attacks being successful. You hear about the big breaches, but what I see, and I monitor about 9 different threat feeds at this point, and I look for successful exploitations of CVEs. That is, a CVE existed, a vulnerability existed on a system, there was no mitigating control, and an exploit was launched against that CVE at the same time. So that's a successful technical exploitation, maybe no breach event occurred. When you monitor that over time, and when you monitor that across a couple of threat feeds, you start to notice that there are only a couple of CVEs throughout all of 2014 that are responsible for a majority of the traffic. It follows a power law scaling phenomenon. And moreover, this is true if you break the data set down any which way. It's scale invariant completely. So by quarter, the same is true. An interesting note here is that a lot of these are very old CVEs, but that's just an aside. My point here is that if it is true that the major volume of breach traffic is concentrated in only a few of those CVEs, it must also be true that those attacks are automated. I doubt anybody is manually firing off 2 million attacks against 2 million different targets or assets. So if that's true, and we have to patch vulnerabilities in some kind of automated way, or patch vulnerabilities that are being automated by attackers, that means that attackers are already ahead of us. They have already automated something before we have created a process for dealing with that automation. So what we need is we need better automation. But where do we need the automation is a good question, because there are some things that can't be automated. Vulnerability assessments can certainly be automated. Incident response, I don't have a good feel for it, I don't work in that, but it seems to me less intuitive that can be automated. I can talk to you about vulnerability management because that's what I'm in. Current vulnerability management has pretty automated vulnerability discovery, and automated I mean we don't have a choice. So we have automated the processes that exist before. NVD and MITRE create our CVEs, create our vulnerability types, scanners pick those up, and that process is a black box for us. We've automated the process of getting that information and getting that data. You can go out and you can buy some other data, but the process is much the same, that somebody else creates that data set, and at the point of contact that you have with it, that line is automated. Scanning, however, is not that automatic. You might have scanners that can be fired off automatically, but most enterprises I work with never actually automate their scanners, or if they do, it's for certain subsets that don't take down business critical processes. So we're getting there. Threat intelligence is incredibly manual. The providers I work with, for the most part, gather their threat intelligence by having really smart people do the kinds of things that targeted attackers do. That is, find out where the attacks are happening, how they're targeted, give them aggregating those data sets. There are forms of manual-ish threat intelligence as well, in that we write signatures for specific attacks, or we write signatures for exploits, let IDS pick them up, look at the breach traffic of that. That's what I do as well. But in reality, those data sets are incredibly biased because to write the signature means that the exploit has already occurred. Our vulnerability scoring is incredibly manual as well, and Steve will know all about that. You have to actually go in and have somebody look at the vulnerability itself, look at the data about it to create a score. And that's only the score that NVD provides you with, in that they describe some elements about the vulnerability. If you want to score vulnerability specifically to your environment, that's an even more manual process. And most importantly, remediation itself, or prioritization of actions, that is the decision science, which is the whole reason why we construct metrics, is incredibly manual as well. So why is it so manual? Because we don't have the data to automate it. It's because the Google Maps of the Uber equivalent doesn't yet exist. We need better base rates for exploitation of vulnerabilities. We need better exploit availability data. Currently, all we've got is Metasploit and ExploitDB. And whenever I want to look at something like a Black Hat exploit kit, I'm crawling Russian forums to look for CVE enumerators, which is not how that should be done. We need better vulnerability trend data. So to say that Microsoft Patch Tuesday is really important is one thing. But when Microsoft releases those patches to say, this is a target of opportunity because it affects 92% of our systems that are currently live and deployed, would be a much more useful metric for me to prioritize whether or not I should fix that vulnerability. We need better breach data to know how the breach occurred, not just what the impact of that breach was. So I collect technical breach data, but it's not impactful breach data. Somewhere in the middle exists a world where we have DBIR data about the impact of those breaches. We have my data about the successful exploitations of vulnerabilities, and we can tie the two together to create better metrics. So sometimes we make bad decisions, and sometimes we have bad metrics, and I think that those two are equivalent statements. It's because whether you explicitly define them in your organization or not, metrics are just decision support. And my whole argument as to why we need to automate better and why we need to define stable metrics to automate better is because good metrics are nothing but objective functions for automation. Think back to any industry that has automated anything in the past, all the way back to Ford's assembly line. The only reason those things are possible is because there becomes a salient field and a salient stable model of data that then you can mine metrics about, or you can define metrics that define success in that field based on the data. And once you have that, you can start to define which processes are automatable and which processes should be automatable. In the Henry Ford example, it's very simple. It was assembly time per car. But until he had assembled enough cars and measured his workers' assembly rates, he couldn't even define the metric of assembly time per car, because a car was a mythical being that you would create by machining some parts. Similarly, in security, when we want to make a prioritization decision, we need to be able to understand what data sets define priority for us. And what makes a metric good, in turn, is a question that we'll explore for the rest of the talk. And by no means am I the authority on what makes a metric good. At the end of this, I've got a really extensive reference list so that people can dive in further. But I think I have some ideas for necessary, if insufficient, criteria for what can make a metric good. Let's start with an example. People use CVSS as a metric for remediation prioritization, but it's not that. It's a description of the vulnerability itself, and the score shouldn't be taken as such. So when you do so, here's what happens. A CVSS 10, which is shell shock, has those exploitations, which what you're seeing on this graph right now, the size of the bubble is the number of successful exploitations in the hour when that data point is recorded. And this starts from the release of Heartbleed all the way up to until I see some shell shock exploitations. And Heartbleed is a CVSS 5 vulnerability that is successfully exploited time and time again, and the rate ramps up over time. So what does this tell you? This tells you that the CVSS 10 score is not descriptive of the amount of successful exploitations on that vulnerability. But it's not trying to do that, so it's not a good metric for measuring that. Moreover, if you zoom out a little bit further, Poodle is a CVSS 4.3, which has substantially more successful exploitations on it than either one of those. So another kind of gut check feel as to what that metric is describing. And if you zoom out even further and take a look at some random vulnerabilities that are all scored CVSS 5 or below, we can see that some CVE for Windows 2000, and I think it affects NT as well, from 2001, sees orders of magnitude more successful exploitations than any of those, but its score is the same 5. So what are we learning? It's that CVSS isn't descriptive. Yes?
Sorry, can I just ask you, where are you getting the exploitation data from?
So it comes from the Alien Vault Threat Exchange, Dell Counter Threat Unit, VeriSign iDefense. SANS actually releases a bunch on a subpage XML feed you can get to. If you go to risk.io, it lists all of our data sources. But the successful exploitation data is indicator of compromise was detected on a system that is linked to that CVE, or exploit fired off, open vulnerability, no mitigating at the same timestamp. So it's both IDS logs and IOC logs. So this comes from about 50,000 businesses right now, 50,000 organizations, and tracking, I think, around 4 million assets. So point here being that it's very clear that the score is not descriptive of successful exploitations. And if that is a data set that is important to you guys, it's important to me, it's a data set I work with, it's clear that the score is not descriptive of that. But CVSS is not the problem, because CVSS itself has a whole bunch of sub-metrics, i.e. access complexity, or local, what is that, where it's executed from, local or remote. Those are good metrics. Those are metrics that are descriptive of the vulnerability and will prove why they're good also with these criteria that I'll enumerate. But CVSS for prioritization is the systemic problem. So if I look at CVSS as a predictor of breach volume on a particular CVE, what I find, and this is a regressive model that tries to identify a score that is indicative of a bucket I've defined. And the buckets I've defined are really crazy. They're like 1 to 2, 2 to 8, 8 to 135, and 135 to 1,000,000. Successful exploitations on that CVE type. The difference in the score that best predicts that is nothing. It's like 0.06 with a really high confidence interval. And what that tells you is that at the far end of the scale, in the 8s, 9s, and 10s, CVSS is a pretty good predictor of breach traffic, but otherwise, not much else is helping you make a decision. Moreover, what it tells you is that you can't make a granular decision like the difference between a CVSS 7 and an 8, and have that be meaningful in predicting breach volume. And I don't think it was ever intended to do that as well. I think there's like 2 possible scores between 7 and 8. but people do this all the time in making their criticality cutoff a 7 or making their criticality cutoff an 8. And so the underlying phenomenon that causes this is that attackers change their tactics almost daily. What you're seeing here is that same data that I showed you before of all those CVEs, but now it's broken up into week-long buckets and shifts week over week. So on the right-hand side, you see attacks that happen a lot during the week, in the hundreds of thousands. On the left-hand side, you see attacks that are low volume and targeted. Maybe they're happening once or twice in the week. Each point is a different CVE. The yellows are WASC IDs. They're web application firewall logs. And week over week, as it shifts, you can see whether the volume is increasing or decreasing. It's logarithmically scaled, so the stuff at the top is stuff you haven't seen before in this week. And the stuff at the bottom is stuff that existed last week but doesn't exist this week. And so I think this is doing like 10 or 15 weeks throughout the end of 2014. And you can clearly see that no matter what you say, the tactics which attackers take, and so regardless of the biases in my data set, what I'm measuring is stable. It would seem that if those attacks are successful, attackers will continue doing the same things. But that's not true. Different attackers are attacking those same assets. They're using different CVEs to target them. And the things of high volume generally stay in the high volume side in that they are the automation that I'm talking about. The things of low volume have crazy variability between them and are shifting all the time because targeted attacks are not all that predictable. So what defines a good metric that can capture that kind of behavior? It's good data. So let's take a look at that type of data and how we can define what makes a good metric for predicting vulnerability prioritization. I give you two systems. Call them systems. Each one has only one asset in it, and each one has one mitigating control in front of it. Call it the same exact firewall. One is protecting $1,000 worth of gremlins. The other one is protecting $1 million worth of widgets. And so if I tell you, consider system A and system B, same mitigating control protects them, which system is more secure? Throw out an answer. Anyone? Right. So the system 1 is more secure because there's less value at risk here. And there are two ways of looking at this problem. There's two ways of drafting metrics. The first is the way that anybody in security would do it by saying there's less at risk here, asset 2 is a bigger target of opportunity, so asset 2 is more secure. The second way is to say they have the same exact mitigating control, so they must be equally secure. And both, I contend, are actually valuable ways of looking at it. The first way of looking at it is one that takes into account the threat environment when crafting the metric. So you are saying that what the attackers are doing should be included in my metric. That's called the type 2 metric. The first metric is a type 1 metric in that it says it's a controlled experiment metric. It ignores the threat environment to generate a base rate to compare the threat environment metric to. And so my contention here is that you need both types of metrics. When people create a phishing email, when they do a crafted phishing email and send it out to their entire enterprise, the success click-through rate of that email is not indicative of the threat environment at all. But it generates a base rate for you to then later be able to assess how phishing emails are impacting your business. That's a type 1 metric that's a controlled experiment that's entirely useful. Type 2 metrics, or CVSS itself is actually a type 1 metric as well. It's descriptive of the vulnerabilities themselves. It gives you a lot of rich data about those vulnerabilities, but it doesn't show you how that data interacts with the threat environment. So a type 2 metric would be something like, does this vulnerability have successful exploitations? Yes or no binary is a type 2 metric. Or percentage of infected machines in your environment is a type 2 metric. So you don't know how many of those machines have what mitigating control in front of them, and that's not factored into the metric. But you are describing the external threat environment. And combining those two metrics allows you to understand how much of your risk is carried by the threat environment and how much of your risk is mitigated by your current status quo controls. So use that frame to evaluate a couple of metrics. Oh, yeah, I actually had a slide about this. Good, I didn't need the slide. So that's essentially the summary of it. You want to be able to both exclude the real-life threat environment in some metrics. Those metrics are not that useful for guiding decision-making or policy, but they are useful for being able to generate type 2 metrics with the inputted information of that threat environment. That's how you use threat intelligence, right? You have a bunch of type 1 metrics that exclude the real-life threat environment, control for the occurrence rate, and tell you about the behavior of either your users or your control systems. You overlay that with your threat intelligence, and you all of a sudden are generating type 2 metrics that talk about the interaction with the threat environment. So what defines a good metric? Well, all of that popped up at once. It was supposed to come up. let's talk about them separately. These are, essentially I did a lit review, and I have the citations at the end of this talk about what people talk about are good metrics. Other people did lit reviews. I did lit reviews of lit reviews. So let's start with, and I have paper to prove it. Let's start with how people define what a security metric is, because this is a hullabaloo in and of itself. There's a bunch of different definitions, and I'm just going to pick out a couple point in times. So in 1999, Kormos and a bunch of other people say that it's a measurable attribute of the result of an SSE CMM security engineering process, ISO 2008 for more details, that could serve as evidence of its effectiveness. The security metric may be objective or subjective, quantitative or qualitative. I think we all disagree with that statement. That was 99. In 2003, Lennon says, IT security metrics provide a practical approach to measuring information security. Evaluating security at the system level, IT security metrics are a tool to facilitate decision-making and accountability through collection of data. That's also a really simple mindset, right? He's just describing type 1 metrics of like, you better know what's happening in your environment. Let's jump ahead to 2014. Security metrics quantitatively describe the level of security for a system. Also a somewhat flawed approach, but I think we're getting somewhere, right? We care about making that data actionable through quantitative methods. And Unchani and Bobby, I don't know how to say these people's names, in 2015 say a security metric is a quantitative measure indicating to which extent the considered entity or process has the attribute of being secure. So I think we're getting closer to a real definition. But the best definition, I think, is based on these factors. A bunch of people, Yasanin and Shrayan, did an assessment of all of these kind of definitions of security metrics, and they teased out what the commonalities in them are. And to them, I added a couple things. So the first commonality across most security metrics is that they need to be bounded. An unbounded security metric is not very useful in a decision process. If you tell me that your metric, I think outside in the hall, we were just talking about this, somebody was using the metric of days to patch as a guide for how many people they should hire. So that's an unbounded metric. If it takes infinity days to patch, it does not mean you should hire infinity people. If it takes 100 days to patch, it does not mean you should hire, infinity divided by whatever people. Once that metric has bounds, once you place it on a scale that allows you to define both the state of no people hired or many people hired, or maybe even the state of I am patching well and I am patching poorly, all of a sudden that becomes a better metric. But without the space in which the metric operates, it's useless. So that's a necessary and sufficient condition for a good metric. The second is that it needs to be scaled metrically. And Alex Hudden, Dan Geer, all sorts of people talk about this infinitely to no end. You need to be able to compare two values and to say that there's a meaningful difference between these two values. That is to say, if you've got a percentage as a metric, great. You can measurably say the difference between 70% and 80%. If you've got a percentage on a crazy metric that makes no sense in and of itself and you can't articulate to me what a 10% increase in that metric is, it's not a good metric. 3 through 5 come from epidemiological statistics. They're not, me saying something should be objective. They're rather really technical, formal mathematical definitions of objectivity, validity, and reliability. A metric is objective if the input data, if it's resistant to changes in the input data. A metric is valid if it has a measurable output and it rises to that output. That is to say, if you've got, a metric that says how many cows have been slaughtered and you put in 2 cows versus 3 cows, 3 should increase the metric in some way towards that objective. It's a really bad example. A better example is to say, a metric that tries to measure exploitability, if there are more exploits, should give you a higher score. If it doesn't, it's not a valid metric. And a metric has to be reliable in that the same inputs generate the same outputs time and time again. So it has to be mapped in a precise manner. Those are just things that allow you to do mathematical operations of metrics. Otherwise, you're just comparing apples to oranges and can't really do much else. The sixth one is a flexible definition. It has to be context specific. And by context specific, I mean what I said earlier, that it has to be a type 2 metric. Or if it's a type 1 metric, it has to be augmented with threat intelligence. Because if it's not, in cybersecurity, there's an adversary who's changing his or her behavior, and that change in behavior is kind of voiding the validity of your metric if it's not context specific or doesn't react to changes in the attacker's behavior. And seventh is a requirement that's contentious, but I don't think it is. It needs to be computed automatically. That's a requirement born both out of just the slew of data that we deal with, but also born out of the fact that you can't use a metric if it's manually computed unless you have an army of foot soldiers. And I think for the purposes of this talk, very few of us have an army of foot soldiers, or very few of us are able to continue to rely on the manual processes for generating metrics. And this is to say that computed automatically can mean if I hire a threat intelligence provider and they have an army of foot soldiers and they're generating information for me, the input to my metric is automatic because I'm not doing that work, right? If I take that data as ground truth, that's okay. So, manual analysis is certainly possible, but your metrics shouldn't rely on any kind of manual analysis because then you can't compute them in real time, and what use are they with a real-time attacker? So let's look at some metrics and see if they pass the test. Mean time to incident discovery is a really interesting metric. So when people do post hoc analysis and look at their incident discovery processes, this is a metric that they use to say, like, how good is our IR team in general? And I think that's a really terrible metric. It's not bounded, first of all, but that's okay. We can deal with that, right? We can say, like, 100 days would be really great if you guys could do that. It is scaled metrically. That is to say, 20 days is 2 times as bad as 10 days. Maybe. It's objective in that those 2 data points of when the incident occurred and when you discovered the incident are stable numbers that can't really argue with those. But it's not valid. And it's not valid in that the number of days to discovery is not necessarily something that you can count or articulate because it could be obfuscated by a whole bunch of things. And also, as that number increases, it does not describe the performance of your incident response team because there's a whole bunch of other factors that could be affecting that, and because teams on different enterprises could be doing the same things faster or slower based on the type 1 metrics, based on what's happening in their control environment, what processes were at stake, or what logs they have access to. It is a reliable metric in that if you throw 2 numbers in it, the same thing pops out every time. It is context specific in that it tries to describe incident response, but here's the kicker. It can't be computed automatically because if you could compute the time when the incident happened automatically, then you would have a 0 incident response time. You would have already responded to the incident. So that gap, or measuring that data, means that you have to manually post hoc go find out when that thing happened based on the new rule sets generated of the incident. And if that's a part of your input into the metric is not measuring the performance of your team. Moreover, if that's true, anybody could game the metric, right? It's not very useful because you can't really measure adherence to the metric over time because different people could adhere to it differently. Vulnerability scanning coverage, however, is an awesome metric. Passes the test on all of these, and that would just be the % of assets that you are scanning with vulnerabilities. It's definitely bounded because it's a percentage, scaled metrically. It's objective in that it's a binary choice about every asset. It's valid and reliable. It's context specific in that it is trying to describe a particular process that it is at the root of, right? There's nothing else in that process that could obfuscate your vulnerability scanning coverage. And it can't be gamed either in that either you scanned it or not, the data backs it up. It's computed automatically because once you've launched a scanner or once you have asset inventory, that's possible to compute it automatically. Let's take a look at CVSS for remediation itself. It's certainly bounded. It does not scale metrically in that I don't know the difference between a 9.7 and a 9.3. Moreover, I don't know the difference between a 10 and a 5 being 2 times as much. It's not objective because the mapping of the fairly objective inputs that CVSS gives us to the score is a pretty subjective mapping. It's not a valid metric in that, note that I say CVSS for remediation, in that it doesn't describe the order in which you should remediate something. It's just describing something about vulnerability, and it's a type 1 metric. It doesn't take into account the threat environment. It is certainly reliable. The same inputs generate the same outputs. But it's not context specific because you could also just as easily game CVSS by saying, I don't have information about this input, and so this is scored higher. And people do that fairly frequently in order to increase the slew of information they do or don't have to deal with. But it can be computed automatically. So we've taken a look at a couple of metrics, and this is my kind of standard set of rules that you should gut check yourself. Does that my metric make sense for my operation? Some of these things are subjective, right? You could argue with me about whether something's objective or valid. You could argue with me about whether something is context specific or not. But as a rule for checking yourself, it's a pretty good one. The other point is that you need data to make metrics. You need data to make data in the first place. And so let's back up to that same data set. It's actually about, at this point, 700 million successful breach events. If you look at those, 2 types kind of emerge as 2 types of vulnerabilities kind of emerge as happening all the time. So there's many different, curves of These are essentially cumulative distribution functions. There's many different cumulative distribution functions of how CVEs behave, but two types segment pretty frequently. And they are those that have attacks before the vulnerability release date, and then when stable weaponized exploits come out, the number of attacks jumps up. Those are generally access complexity high vulnerabilities. And for access complexity low vulnerabilities, as soon as the release date occurs, there's a small ramp up in attacks. Once exploits are publicly available and released, the number of attacks skyrockets and then shoots down over time. And I think the reason for this is because attackers are not dumb. They look at vulnerabilities and think, oh, access complexity low vulnerability, let us craft an exploit and start firing this off in an automatic fashion, see what it catches. This isn't descriptive of all vulnerabilities. But what it is useful for is that you can see the effect of publicly available exploit information on the number of attacks in those particular vulnerabilities. So I present to you a completely different metric, which is, does the vulnerability have a Metasploit module or not? It is bounded because it is 0, 1. It is scaled metrically because having it is worse than not having it. It is objective in that information is actually publicly available and pretty easy to find. It's valid, reliable. It's context specific because all I'm describing is a possibility of exploitation on that metric. It's very hard to game it if by crafting fake, not correct Metasploit modules, somebody will check you. And it's computed automatically because you can just use Shodan's API or Rapid7's API to get it. So why is this metric better for remediation? Let's take a look at two different data sets now. So the first data set that I described is a data set of successful exploitations as indicated by indicators of compromise or IDS events. The second data set that I have is across 2 million assets, I have all of the vulnerability scan data from those assets. That is, I have all the occurrences of open live vulnerabilities on those assets. So NVD currently has like 73,000 vulnerabilities in it. If you pick a random vulnerability in the database, and you look at the number of occurrences of live vulnerabilities in my data set, and conditional on the probability that a breach has occurred or a successful exploitation has occurred on that vulnerability type, and divided by the total number of live vulnerabilities. So what I'm really doing is I'm saying, does this definition have a successful exploitation event associated with it, and how does that scale to the live data set of, I think it's 160 million vulnerabilities at this point? And if you do that, the probability if you pick a random one out of the 72,000 is one that does have a breach event associated with it is 6%. So, you know, some of these vulnerabilities don't show up. Some of the vulnerability definitions don't show up in my data set at all. Some are more pervasive because Adobe Acrobat Reader everybody has. Some are less pervasive. But I contend that it's a type 2 metric for generating remediation because it takes into account the threat environment and has a type 1 metric that is controlled, which is has breach occurred or not. So if you do that, you have a 6% chance of being successful. That means that if you're just randomly picking vulnerabilities to fix, on average, you'll be about 6% successful at doing it. Let's look at CVSS as the same thing. So these are cutoff scores. That is to say, if I pick all vulnerabilities that have a score of 0 or above, which is all of them, what's the probability that I am remediating a vulnerability that has an associated breach event with it? And of course, that's 6% because that's all vulnerabilities. As we move up the chain of CVSS and get to about 6 or 7, you can see a significant increase in the probability of you being successful. So you get to about 8% success rate. And as you move up even further to just remediating, pick one vulnerability that has a CVSS score of 10, remediate that one, you have an 11% chance of being successful at remediating a successful breach event. That's like almost twice as good as random. That's pretty good. However, if you're fixing just the critical vulnerabilities, let's say 8 and above, that's not as good of a strategy as just fixing the 10s. Moreover, let's think about the cost of undertaking such a strategy. If you are fixing just the CVSS 10 vulnerabilities in that data set, you are fixing 23% of all vulnerabilities, which is not a possibility. So we need a test that is more specific, not just sensitive. Let's evaluate that other metric, which is Metasploit against the same thing. If you fix a CVSS 10 vulnerability random, you have an 11% chance of being successful. If you fix something that has an entry in exploit DB, then you have a 17.5% chance of being successful. If you fix a Metasploited vulnerability, one that has an entry in Metasploit, you're down to only about 1,000 CVEs, and you have a 27.5% chance of fixing it. And if you intersect the two data sets, that is, there was a proof of concept exploit DB Metasploit out there, and then a Metasploit module came out, not necessarily in that order, you're down to only about 600 different CVE definitions, and your probability of being successful is 36%. So what have I done here? This is it. I'm done with the talk. But to back it all up, what's important here is the progression of data to well-defined metric to measuring that metric's effectiveness. So if you want to look at more about measuring the effectiveness of a metric or using things like predictive positive value or sensitivity specificity cutoffs like I do here, Dan Geer has an entire day-long workshop on evaluating metrics that you can take a look at. It's available online, actually here. There are references that I'll obviously post. But it's important to measure whether your theory of what is a good metric is correct. So I've given you a couple of necessary, insufficient conditions for making a metric good or making a metric likely to be successful. Those indicate that your selection of metric is okay based on the data set that you have. And obviously, there are some times when you're like, I can't answer the question of whether this is bounded or not, or I can't come up with a way to bound this. That probably means you need to be looking at a different data set or generating a metric from a different data set. And that's actually the way that we drive new data collection efforts to begin with. But start with a data set, start with the richest data sets you can, look at these necessary insufficient criteria to come up with metrics, and then over time, test their performance on live situations. Test their performance as type 2 metrics. Are they actually descriptive of the threat environment, and are they actually adding value to your organization? So as left an exercise left to the reader is to take a look at the metrics that we commonly use right now, walk them through this, and I think much like we find with mean time to incident discovery or average time to patch something, we'll find that we now have richer, better data sets than those kinds of metrics, and it's time to stop using those. That's it.
Cool.
Questions? Comments? Concerns?
So I have a question. So your calculations for that breach calculation where you had the 10, 25, 35 number, that's probably looking backwards at data sets in terms of what could be breached. So a concern I have is if, say, an organization had a model where they're only going to patch things that are in EDB and Metasploit, by the time that they're in EDB and Metasploit, you probably already been compromised.
Well, so yes, you are correct, except that your question assumes that they have a vulnerability that is in Metasploit or EDB to compare to one that is not or one that might be soon. And my answer is, if you have these things and you know that they're being successfully breached or are good indicators of past breaches, you should fix them before you move on to the process of calculating what will be predictably breached later. And I have not yet seen a single organization that doesn't have at least one Metasploit affected vulnerability. What I'm saying is, like, you're right. We should be making predictive models as well. I think we're a bit of ways from being able to make those predictions, or like a set of fresh eyes away from being able to do that with this data set. But
talking about predictions, you were talking about people who patch only CVS 8 and up, and you were presenting this as an alternative to, oh, well, if you patch these, you're going to be much more likely to be patching the critical vulnerabilities. And my point is, if you use this model, then you've already been compromised. Where you can use CVS, that's a nearly instantaneous value. Vulnerability published, you have a CVS score right away. Waiting until it's in EDB and Metasploit, there's a window of time where you retroactively find out, oh, I patched the one that was a critical vulnerability, but now, a week or 2 weeks later before it showed up in the systems, and you probably already compromised.
no, yeah, you're right. There's a lead time. I just think that this is, I'm looking at here, what are your vulnerabilities? Let me make some strategic decisions for you.
Yep.
So looking at these vulnerabilities that you have right now, here's how you decide between which ones to fix next. The question of, and you're right, this is a bad metric for the decision calculus of new vulnerability came out, should I patch it or not? I just don't know of any organizations.
You need a temporal component for that decision process.
Well, you need to be able to predict whether something's going to be an exploit or not, which is probably code analysis as well, not just descriptive data about the vulnerability. But that's a completely different question, right? This is not a valid metric for new vulnerability came out, what's the probability it'll be exploited in the future? This is a valid metric for, I have a set of vulnerabilities, which one do I fix? Yes?
You've used the phrase over and over again, observe breaches, right? This can't be automated, and it has to be self-reporting by entities. So how do you...
This is automated.
What's that?
This is automated.
Observe breaches are?
So this is a breach that has maybe no terminal impact, right? It's a successful exploitation of a vulnerability. this is automated because I have access to the IDS scans of 50,000 businesses in real time.
Yeah, but if my organization doesn't report it, then you can't include it in your...
Right.
Okay, so that's my question. How do you get entities to self-report on breaches? And let's use financial institutions as an example. They're not going to be jumping up and saying, pick me, you've just been breached, right? The number of non-reported incidents/breaches by financial institutions is probably greater by whatever magnitude than reported.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I have no idea how to work a C-suite to do that. Somebody here probably knows better. Yeah, I think going up a level is exactly my answer. The vendors that provide the security products have aggregate anonymized data that allows you to find that same level of information. Because I'm not going to 50,000 businesses and being like, hey, share your data with me. I'm going to the vendor that provides their technical piece of equipment and saying, I want anonymized live data to be able to make these probabilistic decisions. The same thing needs to happen at all levels. Whatever tools they deploy, go to FireEye and say, I want those logs, anonymized and aggregated. And then I can post hoc detect breaches in that data set. So I think that yeah, go ahead. I think you have a comment about that.
Oh, no, I was going to ask you about that.
Okay. Yeah, and insurers is a good idea, right? Like, I don't know what the perverse or non-perverse incentives are to make somebody share data, but I think it's about time we just grabbed it from them anyways.
But, I mean, so having companies insure their cyber risk, right, which they do now, but in a really limited context, or let's say around data loss and breach, but if that were to expand out to intellectual property theft, and ADT type attacks, in theory, it would be the insurers who would be saying, well, we need actuarial data on the risk posture of your organization, and that would be sort of the anonymizing that have insurers say, well, here's the data that we have.
Yeah.
But
or like the progressive plug into your car and drive a certain way thing.
Right, or they would have hardware line network that would be collecting that data for you. The question I want to ask is, you made a comment about, one of the problems is that we don't have good visibility into the tools and technologies that adversaries are using to automate, to basically do what they do, whether it's attack toolkits and so on, that you've got to go crawling around sort of Russian forums to get this data. Thoughts on, is there a way to get more transparency there? What type of value can you extract from better knowledge of what is, tools and technology that we use in the adversary side?
Yeah, I mean, so I try to model the attacker's behavior in doing this, right? Back at my organization, what I try to do is go further than just Metasploit and model out the whole thing, the whole attack chain of like, how useful is this vulnerability to an attacker? What's the probability it'll get exploited? Having both the entries in exploit kits and the price of firing one off would make that economic decision much easier for me. And I've been thinking about how, there's researchers at the University of Trento, Luca Alati specifically, who does this kind of crawling and finds all the black hat exploit kits across like 80 different forums, and he has some scripts that screen scrape, sometimes he logs in manually, sometimes it has to be through Tor. This as a service would be a huge benefit to the whole community. I can't think of a great scalable way to do it, especially because as soon as somebody realizes they're being crawled, this isn't like when I crawl Metasploit, Rapid7's like, great, people are using my product. When you crawl a black hat exploit kit, they're like, great, I'm going to switch the IP. So, if anybody can solve that problem, I will pay you money. Literally. My organization will. Yeah?
So, one thing that I wanted to see if you could talk about is CVSS can be used to understand, or at least might be able to show impact, right? So what you're saying is if there's an open vulnerability and there's traffic from an IDS that needs an attack signature, that is a successful breach. That doesn't mean necessarily that something of value was breached. It just means something was breached, right?
Right.
So
doesn't even mean it was really breached.
Your success criteria is only based on fixing something that may expose something.
My success criteria is code running for an exploit, right? It's like the loosest of success criteria as possible.
So have you looked at like
tightening it up?
Yeah.
It's a good conversation to have. So I don't actually do the percolation analysis of this. I set those rules when I make partnerships with the threat intelligence companies and say, you guys get a lot of aggregate data. Here's what I want you to send back to me, percolate it through this. And your suggestion is actually pretty awesome. What if I only take the things that have a confidentiality impact of high and percolate through that and then compare it to the other one? That's actually a really sweet idea. I would guess that what would intuitively happen? So you would be able to design a much more specific test for those vulnerabilities. Yeah. It's a great idea. Cool. Thank you.